People think the richest houses hide the finest treasures. They don't. They hide the loneliest people. My name is Claire Bennett, and the first thing I noticed about the Romano estate wasn't the size. It wasn't the wrought iron gates that took nearly a full minute to open or the limestone mansion stretching across more acres than my hometown grocery store. It was the silence. The kind that settled over your shoulders like fresh snow, soft enough to seem peaceful until you realized nothing beneath it was alive. I was 24 years old with exactly $318 left in my checking account, 2 overdue utility bills folded inside my purse, and a recommendation letter from an employment agency that promised I was dependable, discreet, and hardworking. Those 3 words had carried me through most of my life. They carried me through the massive front doors that Monday morning as sunlight spilled across polished marble floors so spotless I hesitated before taking another step. The house manager, Mrs. Whitmore, never smiled. Her gray suit looked sharper than most lawyers I'd ever seen, and the silver tablet in her hands contained my entire schedule before I had even memorized the layout of the first floor. She explained every rule in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Never enter the West Wing without permission. Never speak to guests unless they speak first. Never ask questions about the Romano family. The last rule lingered longer than the others. It wasn't written anywhere. She simply stopped walking, looked directly into my eyes, and said, "Curiosity has never lasted very long in this house." Then she continued as though she'd commented on tomorrow's weather. The mansion looked more like a museum than a home. Oil paintings watched from dark paneled walls. Crystal chandeliers reflected ribbons of afternoon light across imported rugs. Every clock ticked with perfect precision, yet somehow the place felt frozen in time. I spent the afternoon polishing windows taller than my apartment building, arranging fresh white lilies in silver vases, and learning which hallways belonged to staff and which belonged to the family. Everyone worked quietly. Even laughter sounded forbidden. By sunset my feet ached inside inexpensive shoes, but finishing early meant I could finally catch my breath. I carried a basket of freshly folded towels toward the rear hallway when I noticed a side door standing slightly open. Cool evening air drifted inside carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth after a light spring rain. I should have walked away. Instead, something pulled me outside. A narrow stone path disappeared behind rows of trimmed hedges until it reached a small family cemetery tucked beneath towering oak trees. I stopped before anyone could see me. A man knelt beside a weathered headstone wearing dark jeans and a simple charcoal sweater, nothing like the tailored suits I'd expected from one of the richest families in New York. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms as he carefully brushed dried mud from a pair of tiny children's boots resting against the stone. Beside them sat a faded toy sailboat with chipped blue paint. He handled both as though they were priceless. The breeze lifted loose strands of his dark brown hair while the last orange light of day caught the sharp lines of his face. He never cried. He never spoke. He simply cleaned the boots until every speck of dirt disappeared, then adjusted the little sailboat by less than an inch, as if perfection mattered to someone who could no longer see it. I had never witnessed grief that looked so quiet. Just as I began stepping backward, a twig snapped beneath my shoe. His head turned instantly. Those pale blue eyes found mine across the fading light, calm but impossible to read. Neither of us moved. The silence between us somehow became even heavier than before. And in that single impossible moment, I realized the most powerful man in the house wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or business partners. He was completely alone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tiny boots resting against the weathered stone and the man whose expression had remained unreadable even after discovering a stranger watching him. By sunrise I had almost convinced myself I had imagined the entire scene. Wealthy families had private traditions. Grief belonged to everyone, no matter how expensive the address. I told myself to forget it. Mrs. Whitmore's warning echoed in my mind as I tied my apron and reported to the kitchen at exactly 6:30. Breakfast at the Romano estate moved with military precision. Fresh pastries arrived from a bakery before dawn. Coffee was brewed in silver pots polished until they reflected every ceiling light. Every plate had a specific position measured to the inch. I focused on memorizing routines because routines felt safe. Questions did not. Around 9 that morning the household changed without anyone announcing it. Staff members straightened their posture. Conversations disappeared. Even footsteps became quieter. A convoy of black luxury vehicles rolled through the front gates, their engines barely audible beneath the fountain outside. I was arranging fresh flowers in the main foyer when several men in tailored suits entered. They greeted no one, yet everyone instinctively moved aside. Their attention was fixed on the man walking several steps behind them. It was him. The same man from the cemetery. Today he wore a navy suit that fit as though it had been stitched onto him, but nothing about his face looked different. The same calm eyes. The same controlled expression. He acknowledged the staff with a slight nod before disappearing into a conference room without speaking a single unnecessary word. No one called him by name. They simply stepped out of his path. I spent the rest of the morning dusting shelves in the East Library, trying not to think about him. Around noon Mrs. Whitmore handed me a tray with tea, mineral water, and neatly folded linen napkins. "Deliver this to the blue conference room," she said. "Knock once. Enter only if invited. Speak only if spoken to." My heartbeat quickened as I carried the tray down the long hallway. The carved oak doors stood closed. Voices drifted through them, low and measured, impossible to understand. I knocked gently. "Come in." The deep voice instantly sent me back to the cemetery. Inside, 6 men sat around an enormous walnut table covered with documents and architectural drawings. No one looked relaxed. They all watched Ethan Romano seated at the far end beneath a wall of tall windows. Sunlight outlined his profile while he quietly studied a folder without appearing rushed by anyone in the room. I kept my eyes lowered as I served each guest. My hands remained steady until I reached Ethan. As I placed his coffee beside him, I noticed the cup already sitting near his right hand. It was untouched. The faint scent rising from it did not smell like coffee at all. It carried a sharp sweetness that did not belong. Before I realized what I was doing, I hesitated. Ethan looked up. For one brief second our eyes met again. The memory of the cemetery flashed between us. Then he calmly slid the untouched cup a few inches away and reached for the fresh one I had just placed before him instead. He never asked why I paused. I never explained. The meeting continued as though nothing unusual had happened. When I collected the empty tray 20 minutes later, the original cup remained exactly where it had been, untouched from the beginning. As I turned toward the door, Ethan spoke for the first time. "Miss Bennet." I stopped. "Thank you." Only 2 words. Quiet. Polite. Yet every other man at that table looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand, as though those 2 simple words had changed something neither I nor they could fully explain. I expected the strange moment in the conference room to disappear like everything else inside the Romano estate. Instead, it followed me through the rest of the week in ways I could not explain. No one mentioned the untouched coffee. No one mentioned Ethan thanking a maid by name. But I noticed the small changes. Conversations stopped whenever I entered certain rooms. Staff members looked at me a second longer than before. Mrs. Whitmore assigned me to different sections of the mansion, almost as if she wanted to keep me away from places where important people gathered. I did not complain. I had learned years ago that keeping a steady paycheck usually meant keeping quiet. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and warm spring air drifting through the open windows. The estate buzzed with preparations for a family luncheon. Fresh flowers covered every dining table. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Luxury cars rolled through the gates every few minutes, bringing relatives whose expensive smiles somehow felt colder than the marble floors beneath their feet. I carried folded napkins into the formal dining room just as the guests began arriving. An older gentleman with silver hair barely glanced at Ethan before greeting another younger man with an enthusiastic embrace. A stylish woman kissed everyone at the table except Ethan, offering him nothing more than a polite nod. Another man, perhaps in his early 30s, laughed loudly while several relatives gathered around him with effortless warmth. I watched from the edge of the room, pretending to adjust silverware, and something quietly unsettled me. Ethan was always included, yet somehow never welcomed. His chair stood at the head of the table, but conversations flowed around him instead of toward him. Every decision required his approval, yet no one sought his opinion until the very last moment. It was like watching someone own the stage while everyone else performed as though he were invisible. During lunch I refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. Voices remained pleasant, but underneath every compliment I sensed invisible walls built from years of unspoken history. Then I heard it. I had just stepped through the service entrance when one of the younger relatives spoke a little louder than he intended. Leadership is about earning loyalty, not inheriting it. Several people chuckled softly. Another voice replied, sometimes the family chooses differently than tradition expects. Silence followed. When I looked toward Ethan, he simply continued cutting his grilled salmon with calm, measured movements, showing no sign that he had heard any of it. Yet something about the tightness in his jaw told me he had heard every single word. After the meal ended, guests wandered onto the terrace overlooking the gardens. I carried a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen when I noticed Ethan standing alone beside the reflecting pool. The afternoon breeze stirred the surface of the water while cherry blossom petals floated quietly across it. He stared at the reflection without moving. For a moment he looked less like the heir to a powerful empire and more like a man searching for a place where he belonged. I almost walked away. Instead, I stopped a respectful distance behind him. "Beautiful day," I said softly before realizing I had probably crossed another invisible line. He looked toward the water instead of me. "Beautiful things can still feel empty, Miss Bennet." His answer surprised me because it sounded less like conversation and more like something he had been telling himself for years. Before I could respond, footsteps approached from behind. The younger relative who had received all the laughter earlier walked onto the terrace with an effortless smile. "There you are, cousin, everyone is looking for you." Ethan nodded once and followed him inside without another word. As they disappeared through the glass doors, I noticed something I had missed before. Every member of the Romano family called Ethan the heir. Only one of them ever called him family. The weekend settled over the estate with the kind of quiet that always made me uneasy. Wealth had a way of making silence feel expensive, but inside the Romano mansion it carried something heavier. It carried secrets. By Monday morning the gardens glowed beneath fresh sunshine, every hedge trimmed with impossible precision, every fountain sparkling as though nothing in the world could ever be out of place. I spent the first half of the day replacing flowers in the west corridor, one of the few areas staff members rarely entered. Mrs. Whitmore had given me temporary permission because several arrangements had wilted after the family luncheon. Work usually helped me stop thinking, but Ethan's words from the reflecting pool kept returning to me. Beautiful things can still feel empty. I understood those words better than I wanted to admit. My childhood apartment had never been beautiful, but after my parents passed away it had become painfully empty. Sometimes loneliness wore designer clothes instead of worn-out denim. As I carried fresh white roses toward the hallway, I heard voices drifting from a study whose door had not completely closed. I should have continued walking. Instead, I paused only long enough to make sure no one was coming down the corridor. The voices belonged to older members of the Romano family. Their tone remained calm, almost casual, which somehow made the conversation feel even more unsettling. "The board meeting is next month," one man said. "We cannot keep delaying the announcement forever." Another voice answered, "Tradition matters, but survival matters more." There was a brief silence before someone quietly replied, "Lucas has the support we need." Ethan has respect, but respect alone does not build consensus anymore. My hands tightened around the vase. "Lucas." The smiling cousin from the luncheon. Another voice spoke, softer than the others. "The old chairman still insists Ethan should inherit everything. He made that decision years ago." Then we convince him circumstances have changed. The family deserves stability. Footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the hallway. My heartbeat immediately quickened. I stepped away from the door and continued arranging flowers as naturally as I could just before two assistants rounded the corner carrying folders. Neither of them noticed me. I finished replacing the roses with hands that suddenly felt colder than the marble beneath my shoes. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore asked me to deliver several financial binders to Ethan's office. I knocked once before entering. He stood beside the tall windows overlooking the lake, reading through documents stacked across his desk. Sunlight outlined his shoulders while dozens of unopened envelopes rested neatly beside him. He looked tired, although he would never have admitted it. "You may leave them there, Miss Bennet," he said without looking up. I placed the binders carefully on the desk, but before turning away I noticed a framed photograph tucked beside the bookshelf. A younger Ethan stood beside an older gentleman whose warm smile contrasted sharply with the serious expressions I had grown used to seeing inside the mansion. Between them stood the same little boy whose tiny boots rested at the cemetery. They all looked genuinely happy. The picture felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Family photographs usually captured what people wanted the world to believe. This one captured something they had already lost. Ethan noticed where I was looking. "My grandfather believed loyalty was earned every day," he said quietly. "He taught me that titles mean nothing without character." His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet respect. Before I could answer, a notification appeared on his computer screen. His eyes scanned the message for only a second before the warmth disappeared from his expression. He closed the window immediately. "Everything is changing much sooner than I expected," he murmured, almost to himself. I did not ask what he meant because I already suspected the answer. As I reached the door, he spoke again. "Miss Bennet." I turned. "If anyone asks, you were never here longer than necessary." His tone remained calm, but for the first time since arriving at the Romano estate, I realized he was not protecting himself. Somehow, without understanding why, he was trying to protect me. The next few days taught me something no employee handbook ever could. A mansion could have hundreds of rooms, but the truth always found the smallest cracks to escape through. After overhearing the conversation outside the study, I became painfully aware of the invisible currents flowing beneath every polite smile. Lucas seemed to be everywhere. He laughed easily with investors, shared effortless conversations with distant relatives, and somehow always managed to stand beside the family patriarch whenever photographs were taken. Ethan, on the other hand, spent most of his days inside meetings or walking the estate alone before sunrise. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. One Thursday evening, after nearly 12 hours of work, I carried a basket of freshly pressed linens toward the east wing when I heard the unmistakable sound of a piano. The melody drifted softly through the hallway, slow enough to stop me in my tracks. I followed it to a sitting room where the lights were dim except for a single lamp beside the grand piano. Ethan sat alone on the bench, his jacket folded neatly over a chair. His fingers moved across the keys with quiet confidence, filling the room with a peace that sounded more like a memory than a performance. He noticed me almost immediately, yet he did not stop playing until the final note faded into silence. "I am sorry," I said, embarrassed that I had interrupted. "I was only passing by." He closed the piano lid gently. "Most people walk away when they hear someone practicing. You stayed." I smiled awkwardly. It did not sound like practice. It sounded like someone trying to remember something. For the first time since I had arrived at the estate, the corners of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was not a full smile. It was brief enough that I almost questioned whether I had imagined it. "My mother used to play this piece," he admitted. "She believed difficult days deserved beautiful endings." The room grew quiet again. I looked around at the enormous bookshelves, the polished wood, the expensive artwork that surrounded us. It was breathtaking. Yet somehow it still felt less alive than the tiny apartment I had rented after college. "May I tell you something honestly?" I asked before I could stop myself. He nodded once. Everyone here seems afraid of disappointing you. But I think they spend even more time trying to impress each other. Nobody actually talks to you. They only talk around you." The words escaped before I realized how reckless they were. I immediately lowered my eyes. "I am sorry. That was inappropriate. I should not have said that." Instead of sounding offended, Ethan let out a soft breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh. "You are either very brave, Miss Bennet, or very unfamiliar with how this family works." "Probably both," I admitted. Another silence settled between us, but this one felt different. It no longer carried the weight of suspicion. It carried understanding. Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the gardens where evening sunlight painted the trees in shades of gold. "Do you know why I thanked you the other day?" he asked. "Because of the coffee." He slowly shook his head. "No. Because you hesitated. Everyone else in this house reacts after they calculate the consequences. You reacted because something felt wrong. There is a difference." His words lingered in the air longer than either of us expected. Just then the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7. The sound echoed through the quiet room, reminding us both where we were. Ethan picked up his jacket and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused without turning around. "Miss Bennet. Do not lose that instinct. It may become more valuable than either of us realizes." As he disappeared into the hallway, I noticed something I had never seen before. The loneliness that had surrounded him since my first day at the estate had cracked ever so slightly. And somehow, against all reason, I realized I had been the one who caused the first small fracture. The invitation arrived on thick cream-colored paper embossed with the Romano family crest, although everyone in the house already knew about the dinner long before the cards appeared. Staff members polished silver until they could see their reflections. Fresh orchids replaced every arrangement from the previous week. The chef rejected 3 entire shipments of produce because they were not perfect enough for the evening. It felt less like preparing for a meal and more like preparing for a performance where every guest already knew their role. By 6 o'clock luxury sedans lined the circular driveway beneath rows of glowing lanterns. The dining room shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every place setting measured with impossible precision. I stood beside the service entrance holding a tray of sparkling water while relatives, business partners, and longtime family friends filled the room with effortless conversation. Expensive watches flashed beneath soft lighting. Crystal glasses chimed gently as polite laughter floated through the air. From a distance everything looked flawless. Up close, every smile seemed carefully rehearsed. Ethan entered exactly on time wearing a charcoal suit that somehow made him look even more reserved than usual. He greeted every guest with quiet courtesy before taking his place near the head of the table. Across from him sat Lucas, perfectly relaxed, accepting compliments with the confidence of someone who already believed the evening belonged to him. The family patriarch, Mr. Vincent Romano, arrived last. Though age had slowed his steps, his presence immediately quieted the room. Everyone rose. He acknowledged them with a warm smile before inviting the guests to sit. Dinner began peacefully. Courses arrived one after another with practiced precision while conversations drifted from business to travel to charitable foundations. I moved carefully between chairs, refilling glasses and replacing empty plates. Yet beneath the pleasant voices I sensed invisible tension tightening with every passing minute. It finally surfaced during dessert. Mr. Romano gently placed his fork beside his plate and cleared his throat. "There is something important I wish to discuss before next month's board meeting," he said. Every conversation stopped. Even the musicians performing softly in the adjoining room seemed to fade into the background. He looked first toward Ethan, then across the table toward Lucas. "My greatest hope has always been preserving this family beyond my lifetime. That future depends not only upon leadership but upon trust." Before he could continue, another older relative interrupted with surprising calm. "Trust must be earned continuously. Circumstances evolve. We must adapt." Several heads nodded almost imperceptibly. Lucas lowered his eyes respectfully, saying nothing at all. Ethan remained completely still. The silence stretched longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Then another voice joined the conversation. Perhaps delaying the succession announcement would allow everyone more time to evaluate the best path forward. The words sounded reasonable. Almost gentle. Yet they landed in the room like cold rain. I looked toward Mr. Romano. The warmth had disappeared from his face. For the first time that evening he looked every bit his age. Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady and remarkably calm. If anyone believes another candidate would better serve this family, they deserve the opportunity to say so openly. No accusation. No anger. Just quiet honesty. Yet no one answered immediately. Instead they glanced toward one another, measuring reactions before offering opinions. It was the first time I truly understood what loneliness looked like inside a crowded room. Eventually Lucas leaned forward with an expression of perfect humility. Whatever this family decides, I will support it completely. His words sounded generous. Somehow they felt rehearsed. Mr. Romano slowly rose from his chair. We will continue this discussion another day, he said. Dinner is over. Guests began standing almost immediately, conversations returning in cautious whispers as though nothing significant had happened. I gathered empty dessert plates with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. Across the room Ethan thanked every guest for attending before quietly helping his grandfather to the library. Not a single relative offered to walk beside them. As the last of the visitors disappeared into the foyer, I noticed one detail no one else seemed to see. The family portrait hanging above the fireplace reflected every person leaving the room. Every person except Ethan, who had already been left behind long before anyone reached the door. The morning after the family dinner felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight poured through the tall kitchen windows while coffee brewed and fresh bread filled the air with warmth that almost convinced me the tension from the night before had never happened. The staff returned to their routines with practiced efficiency, yet the conversations were shorter than usual. Even the chefs lowered their voices whenever someone mentioned the Romano family. I spent the morning changing linens in the guest suites until Mrs. Whitmore unexpectedly handed me a ring of brass keys. The West study requires cleaning today, she said. Be careful with the documents. Do not move anything that belongs on the desk. I nodded and made my way upstairs. The West study overlooked the gardens where spring flowers had begun to bloom in perfect rows. It was a beautiful room filled with leather-bound books, antique maps, and polished mahogany furniture that carried the scent of cedar and old paper. Everything appeared untouched. I dusted the shelves, wiped the windows, and carefully arranged the chairs exactly as I had found them. As I lifted a stack of magazines from the corner table, a folded envelope slipped onto the hardwood floor. I bent down to pick it up, intending to place it back where it belonged, but one line typed across the front caught my eye before I could look away. Board recommendation. Candidate review. Lucas Romano. My heart skipped. I immediately slid the envelope back beneath the magazines without opening it. It was none of my business. It should have ended there. A few minutes later the study door opened behind me. I turned expecting Mrs. Whitmore. Instead I found Lucas leaning casually against the doorway with an easy smile. Working hard as always, Miss Bennet, he said. I smiled politely. Just finishing up. His eyes drifted across the room before stopping on the corner table. For one brief moment his smile faded. Then it returned just as quickly. Thank you. You may go. Something about the exchange left me uneasy, but I could not explain why. By early afternoon the entire atmosphere inside the mansion shifted. Staff members were quietly summoned into the main hall one by one. When my turn came, Mrs. Whitmore stood beside two family advisors whose expressions revealed nothing. An important folder has disappeared from the West study, one advisor said. We are asking everyone assigned to that area a few routine questions. I answered honestly. I described everything I had cleaned, every surface I had touched, every minute I had spent inside the room. Then the advisor placed a cream-colored envelope onto the table between us. My breath caught instantly. It was the same envelope I had seen beneath the magazines. It had somehow become folded inside one of my cleaning towels. I stared at it in disbelief. "I have never seen that inside my cart," I whispered. "I did not take it." Mrs. Whitmore looked genuinely troubled, but she remained silent. Procedures required every employee's locker to be inspected. Mine revealed nothing unusual, yet the envelope alone seemed enough to fill the room with quiet suspicion. By evening the decision had already been made. "Until the matter is clarified, your employment is suspended," the advisor announced. "Please gather your personal belongings." My ears rang so loudly I barely heard the rest. I packed my small canvas bag in silence while the other staff members avoided my eyes. As I stepped outside the front entrance carrying everything I owned, light rain began falling across the stone driveway. I turned back once toward the mansion that had begun feeling almost familiar. Ethan's office windows were dark. He was away at meetings downtown and knew nothing about what had happened. The heavy gates slowly opened before me. Just as I crossed the property line, I glanced back one final time. High above, on the third floor, one window suddenly lit up. A lone figure stood perfectly still behind the glass. Even from that distance, I knew exactly who it was. The only person who had believed I always followed my instincts had not been there when someone carefully arranged for those instincts to become the reason I lost everything. Rain has a way of making every city look honest. It softens sharp edges, washes away footprints, and convinces you that tomorrow might begin differently. I wanted to believe that as I unlocked the door to my tiny apartment just after sunset. The room was barely 500 square feet, with chipped white paint, a second-hand couch, and a kitchen so small I could reach every cabinet without taking a single step. 2 weeks earlier I would have called it temporary. That night it felt like the only place in the world that still belonged to me. I placed my canvas bag beside the couch and stared at the folded uniform I no longer had a reason to wear. My phone remained silent. No missed calls. No messages. I had expected disappointment. I had not expected how quickly people could disappear from your life once your name became attached to suspicion. The following morning I walked 3 blocks to the neighborhood diner where I usually bought coffee before work. The waitress recognized me immediately. "No early shift today, Claire?" she asked with a warm smile. I forced one back. "Just taking a few days off." The lie tasted bitter, but explaining the truth felt even worse. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, Ethan returned to the estate after 2 days of meetings in Manhattan. The mansion looked exactly as he had left it, yet something immediately felt different. Staff members avoided eye contact. Mrs. Whitmore greeted him with unusual hesitation. Finally, she handed him a folder containing the report about the missing document and my dismissal. Ethan read every page without speaking. Then he looked up with quiet disbelief. "Miss Bennet stole this?" Mrs. Whitmore lowered her eyes. "That is the official conclusion." "Official," he repeated softly. "Not factual." She remained silent. Ethan closed the folder and walked directly to the west study. Nothing inside the room appeared unusual until he stopped beside the corner table where I had found the envelope. He crouched beside it for several long seconds before sliding his fingers beneath the carved wooden edge. Hidden there, nearly invisible against the dark finish, was a tiny adhesive residue no larger than a postage stamp. Someone had attached the envelope beneath the table before placing it elsewhere. He stood slowly, his expression growing colder not with anger but with certainty. This had not been an accident. It had been prepared. He requested the hallway security recordings from that afternoon. The estate maintained cameras throughout the common areas, but not inside private rooms. Hours of footage rolled across the monitor in silence. Staff members entered and exited exactly according to schedule. Then Ethan noticed something everyone else had overlooked. Lucas stepped into the west hallway nearly 15 minutes before I had been assigned to clean the study. He carried nothing when he entered. He left adjusting the cuff of his jacket with unusual care, his left sleeve brushing briefly against the study doorframe. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Most people would never have noticed it. Ethan watched the clip 5 more times. Then he quietly asked for every hallway recording from the previous week. By evening a pattern had emerged. Lucas had visited areas he rarely entered. Documents had changed locations. Meetings had been quietly rearranged. Tiny details that meant nothing alone suddenly formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. Ethan closed the final recording and looked out the office window toward the rain falling beyond the gardens. "Where does Claire Bennett live?" he asked. One of his advisors looked surprised. "We can locate the address within the hour." "Do it." The advisor hesitated. "May I ask why?" Ethan picked up the worn recommendation letter from my employment file that Mrs. Whitmore had included with the investigation documents. He read the final sentence once more. Dependable. Discreet. Hardworking. Then he smiled so faintly it almost disappeared before anyone noticed. "Because someone tried very hard to make me stop trusting the only person in this house who never once asked me for anything. And I intend to find her before whoever planned this realizes I have already begun asking the right questions." Some truths do not arrive with sirens or shattered glass. They arrive disguised as ordinary afternoons, hidden inside small decisions that seem meaningless until they change everything. 3 days had passed since I left the estate. My savings were shrinking faster than I wanted to admit, so I spent every morning filling out job applications and every afternoon helping at the neighborhood community center where children gathered after school until their parents finished work. The position was unpaid, but sitting in a room filled with laughter reminded me that kindness still existed outside grand estates and polished boardrooms. For a few precious hours each day, I stopped thinking about accusations and unanswered questions. On Friday evening the sky turned the color of fading steel as I walked home carrying a paper bag filled with groceries that barely fit my budget. Halfway down my block, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It blended into the line of ordinary cars well enough that most people would have ignored it. I almost did. Then I realized it was still there an hour later after I returned from taking out the trash. The engine remained off. No one stepped outside. I told myself I was imagining things. Across the city, Ethan sat alone inside his grandfather's library studying another stack of records. Every answer uncovered 2 new questions. Financial reports had been quietly revised. Meeting schedules had shifted without explanation. Employees who had worked for the family for decades suddenly remembered conversations differently. None of it proved who had arranged the trap, but every trail seemed to circle back toward the same handful of people. Then Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a small notebook she had found while reorganizing the housekeeping office. "Miss Bennett left this behind," she explained. Ethan accepted it carefully. It was nothing more than an inexpensive spiral notebook. Grocery lists filled the first pages. Cleaning schedules occupied the next several. Then he reached a page where I had written a simple observation after my first week at the mansion. "The quietest person in the room is usually carrying the heaviest burden." Ethan stared at the sentence for several long moments before closing the notebook. "She notices everything," he murmured. Mrs. Whitmore nodded gently. "That is exactly why I never believed she would steal anything." Ethan looked toward her with quiet surprise. "Why did you not say so?" "Because nobody asked what I believed. They only asked whether procedures had been followed." The answer lingered heavily between them. Meanwhile, as evening settled over my neighborhood, I decided to take a short walk to clear my mind. The streets were peaceful. Porch lights flickered on one by one while families gathered around dinner tables behind glowing windows. Yet the strange feeling of being watched refused to disappear. I stopped beside the corner bakery and casually glanced into its front window, pretending to admire the display. Reflected in the glass, nearly half a block behind me, stood the same black sedan. Still parked. Still waiting. My pulse quickened. I continued walking without changing pace until I reached my apartment building. Just before unlocking the front door, I looked back again. This time the car slowly pulled away without turning on its headlights until it reached the next intersection. It disappeared into traffic as quietly as it had arrived. The following morning Ethan received a phone call from one of his trusted investigators. "We located Miss Bennett yesterday," the man reported. "She appears safe." Ethan released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Then the investigator continued. "There is one problem. She is no longer the only person looking over her shoulder. Someone else began monitoring her apartment before we arrived." Ethan stood so quickly his chair slid backward across the hardwood floor. He did not ask who. He already knew the answer mattered less than what came next. For the first time since this quiet war had begun, he realized he was no longer racing to uncover the truth. He was racing against someone who had just made Claire part of the game. The hardest choices rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as opportunities, asking what you are willing to lose before you understand what you are trying to save. I had barely finished breakfast the next morning when someone knocked on my apartment door. My heart immediately raced. For several seconds I simply stood there listening. The hallway remained silent. No voices. No footsteps. I looked through the peephole and froze. Ethan stood outside alone wearing dark jeans, a navy jacket, and no tie, looking nothing like the man who usually commanded conference rooms filled with executives. He looked tired. More human than I had ever seen him. I opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Romano." He gave a small shake of his head. "Ethan. At least today." I stepped aside without thinking. My apartment suddenly felt impossibly small. The old couch, the tiny kitchen table, the stack of library books beside the window. None of it belonged in his world. Yet he looked around with genuine curiosity instead of judgment. "I am sorry about what happened," he said quietly. "You should never have been dismissed." I searched his face for any sign of doubt. "Do you believe me?" He answered without hesitation. "I never stopped believing you." The words settled into the room with a weight I had not expected. For days I had questioned my own memory, wondering if somehow I had made a mistake without realizing it. Hearing someone trust me so completely almost hurt more than the accusation itself. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed my small spiral notebook on the kitchen table. "You left this behind." I picked it up carefully, embarrassed by the worn cover and handwritten grocery lists inside. "I did not think anyone would read it." "I only read one page," he admitted. "It was enough." Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen for only a second before slipping it back into his pocket. Something had changed. I could see it immediately in his expression. "Is everything all right?" I asked. He looked toward the window overlooking the quiet street. "The board has moved tomorrow's succession meeting to this afternoon. Several directors changed their votes overnight. They believe announcing new leadership immediately will prevent further division inside the family." "You mean Lucas?" Ethan nodded once. "They want me to attend, smile for the cameras, congratulate my cousin, and make the transition appear unanimous." I could hear disappointment beneath his calm voice, but not resentment. It sounded more like someone preparing to let go of something he had carried for far too long. "Then why are you here?" He looked directly at me. "Because the investigator I hired confirmed someone has been watching your apartment. If I attend that meeting, I will spend the next 6 hours surrounded by people discussing titles while you remain alone with questions I still cannot answer." Silence filled the room. Finally I spoke. "Ethan, you have spent your entire life preparing for today. You cannot walk away because of me." He smiled faintly, the same almost invisible smile I had seen beside the piano. "That is where you are wrong, Claire. I spent my entire life believing responsibility meant protecting an inheritance. My grandfather spent his life trying to teach me that responsibility means protecting people. There is a difference. Outside, another light rain began tapping gently against the windows. Ethan stood and walked toward the door. My security team will remain nearby until we understand who has been following you. As for the meeting, they will manage without me. I stared at him in disbelief. They will never forgive you for missing it. He rested one hand on the doorknob before answering. Then perhaps they were never looking for a leader. Perhaps they were only looking for someone willing to surrender what mattered most in exchange for a title. He opened the door and stepped into the rain without another word. Hours later, across the city, the Romano board meeting began with one chair left completely empty, and for the first time in the family's history, the absence of its rightful heir spoke louder than any speech ever could. The board meeting ended without applause. News spread through the business world before sunset that the Romano family had postponed its succession announcement indefinitely. Financial reporters called it a strategic delay. Investors called it uncertainty. Inside the family, it became something much more dangerous. It became a question no one could answer. Why had Ethan Romano willingly walked away? The following morning he returned to the estate before sunrise. The mansion looked unchanged, but everyone inside moved as though the walls themselves were listening. No one mentioned the empty chair from the previous afternoon. No one asked where he had been. Silence had become the family's preferred language. Meanwhile, I received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Whitmore. Her voice sounded softer than I had ever heard it. "Miss Bennet, there is something I believe you should see." She asked me to meet her at a small chapel less than 10 minutes from the estate, explaining that it would be better than returning to the mansion while tensions remained high. Curiosity overcame hesitation. By late afternoon I found her waiting near the entrance holding a weathered leather box no larger than a shoebox. We sat together on an old wooden bench beneath stained glass windows glowing with afternoon light. She placed the box gently between us. "This belonged to Ethan's mother," she said quietly. "She asked me to keep it safe many years ago." I looked at her in surprise. "Why are you showing it to me?" "Because I believe she would have wanted someone kind to remember who her son really is." Inside the box rested photographs, handwritten letters, and a faded music book with worn edges. One photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed a smiling woman sitting beside the same grand piano I had seen Ethan playing. A young Ethan, perhaps 8 years old, leaned against her shoulder while the little boy from the cemetery sat laughing on the floor with wooden toy boats scattered around him. They looked nothing like the quiet family I had come to know. They looked ordinary. Happy. Loved. Mrs. Whitmore gently unfolded one of the letters. "His mother volunteered every Saturday at children's hospitals," she explained. "Ethan always went with her. She believed kindness should never depend upon wealth. After she became ill, she worried that the family would teach him power before compassion. She was afraid he would forget who she had raised him to be." I carefully turned another page inside the music book and found a sentence written in elegant handwriting beneath the notes. "If one day the world tells you to become harder, choose instead to become kinder. Strength that protects will always outlive strength that controls." I felt my throat tighten. Those words explained everything I had struggled to understand. The cemetery. The piano. The quiet gratitude. The lonely walks through the gardens. Ethan had never been trying to become different from his family. He had been trying not to forget his mother. Before either of us spoke again, footsteps echoed softly across the chapel floor. Ethan stood near the entrance, having arrived without either of us noticing. His eyes settled on the open music book before meeting mine. For a long moment none of us said anything. Finally he walked closer and gently rested his hand on the worn leather cover. "She used to tell me that the easiest way to measure a person's character was to watch how they treated someone who could offer them nothing in return." He smiled sadly as he looked at the old photograph. "I spent years believing I had failed her because I could not keep this family together." Claire, for the first time since we met, reached across the bench and placed my hand lightly over his. "No, Ethan. You did not fail your mother. You became exactly the son she hoped you would be." His eyes closed for only a moment, as though those words had lifted a burden he had been carrying for years. Neither of us realized that outside the chapel, parked quietly beneath the shade of old maple trees, someone had already photographed the moment that changed everything. The truth did not explode into the Romano family. It arrived quietly, one document at a time, until every carefully built lie collapsed beneath its own weight. 2 mornings after we met at the chapel, Ethan received an invitation from his grandfather requesting a private gathering inside the estate library. Only immediate family members and a handful of longtime advisors would attend. No reporters. No investors. No public statements. Just the people whose decisions had shaped the family for decades. Ethan asked if I would come, not as an employee but simply as someone he trusted. I hesitated. I had no place inside that room. He answered gently before I could refuse. Sometimes the people with no title are the only ones who still see the truth clearly. The library felt different that afternoon. Heavy curtains softened the sunlight while shelves filled with generations of family history surrounded everyone in quiet judgment. Vincent Romano sat at the head of the long table looking older than I remembered, but his eyes remained clear. Lucas occupied a seat nearby, confident as always, while the remaining relatives waited with carefully controlled expressions. Ethan entered without ceremony and quietly placed a leather folder before his grandfather. No speeches. No accusations. Just evidence collected patiently over weeks of careful observation. Security records. Meeting schedules. Internal correspondence. Hallway footage showing documents being moved before staff entered restricted rooms. Financial revisions authorized without proper approval. Individually they appeared insignificant. Together they revealed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Silence settled over the room as each page was examined. Lucas attempted to explain the discrepancies as administrative misunderstandings, but every answer led to another document that quietly contradicted it. No voices were raised. No dramatic confrontations unfolded. The weight of the truth proved more powerful than anger ever could have been. Finally Vincent removed his reading glasses and looked slowly around the table. For many years, he said, I believed this family could be protected by controlling every decision. Instead I created a house where people feared honesty more than failure. His words seemed to reach every corner of the room. Several relatives lowered their eyes. Others remained motionless, unable to deny what lay before them. Vincent turned toward Lucas with unmistakable disappointment. Ambition without integrity is not leadership. It is only ambition. Then he looked at Ethan. And integrity without recognition is still integrity. I should have remembered that sooner. The meeting ended without celebration. Several advisors quietly resigned before the afternoon was over. Others admitted they had remained silent because they believed opposing the growing influence around Lucas would divide the family even further. Instead, their silence had nearly destroyed it. As the room gradually emptied, Vincent asked me to remain for a moment. Claire, he said with a gentle smile, Ethan's mother often reminded me that ordinary people notice extraordinary things because they are not distracted by power. You reminded my grandson of that lesson when the rest of us had forgotten it. I could think of nothing to say except thank you. Later that evening the three of us walked through the gardens where the first fireflies of summer flickered above the grass. Vincent stopped beside the reflecting pool and placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. The inheritance was never the buildings, the businesses, or the family name, he said softly. It was always the responsibility to become the kind of man people would willingly follow. I almost took that away from you because I listened to the loudest voices instead of the truest one. Ethan did not answer immediately. Finally he smiled with quiet peace rather than triumph. If this family has another chance, let us build it on trust instead of fear. Vincent nodded slowly. For the first time since I had entered the Romano estate, the silence around us no longer felt lonely. It felt hopeful. And as the evening breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the gardens, I realized that the greatest victory had never been winning control of an empire. It had been giving a broken family the courage to tell each other the truth. 1 year can feel like a lifetime when people choose honesty over fear. The Romano estate still stood behind its iron gates, its gardens still bloomed with impossible precision, and the marble hallways still reflected the morning sunlight exactly as they always had. Yet everything important had changed. The mansion no longer felt like a place where silence buried the truth. It had become a place where conversations lasted longer than meetings and where laughter no longer sounded out of place. Several longtime employees who had quietly considered leaving decided to stay. New community programs carrying Ethan's mother's name supported children's hospitals and neighborhood schools throughout the city, continuing the work she had once begun. Vincent Romano officially stepped away from daily leadership, not because age demanded it but because trust required room for the next generation to lead differently. Ethan accepted the responsibility he had once nearly abandoned, but he never moved into the grand office overlooking the estate. Instead, he chose a smaller room with wide windows facing the gardens, explaining that people deserved to see the seasons change while making important decisions. Some traditions remained. Every Sunday evening he still walked to the quiet cemetery beneath the old oak trees carrying fresh flowers. Only now he was no longer alone. I always walked beside him. We never needed many words there. Some places taught you that love was measured more by presence than conversation. I never returned to working as a maid. When Ethan asked whether I would consider overseeing the family's charitable foundation, I laughed because I had never imagined someone like me belonged inside board meetings. He smiled the same quiet smile I had come to know so well. You belonged long before anyone noticed, Claire. You were simply the first person brave enough to remind us what we had forgotten. Slowly I learned that changing lives did not always require extraordinary speeches. Sometimes it meant approving scholarships, restoring neighborhood libraries, or making certain no child lost access to music simply because their family could not afford lessons. Every time I heard a piano through an open window, I thought about the faded sentence inside Ethan's mother's music book. Choose kindness. It remained the simplest advice I had ever known, and somehow the hardest to practice every single day. One cool autumn evening Ethan asked me to drive with him instead of using one of the family cars. We left the city behind until the streets narrowed into quiet country roads lined with maple trees glowing shades of gold and crimson. Finally he stopped beside a small white farmhouse overlooking rolling fields where the wind carried the scent of fresh apples and cedar. It was modest. Peaceful. Completely unlike the world where we had first met. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows onto wooden floors warmed by afternoon light. A kettle rested on the stove. Books filled simple shelves. Fresh bread cooled beside the counter. It already felt like someone had been living there for years, even though the paint still smelled new. Ethan looked around slowly before turning toward me. Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me that was not about work? I smiled. I told you that everyone talked around you instead of talking to you. He nodded. You were right. I spent most of my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Then one ordinary woman walked into a silent house carrying nothing except honesty. You never asked for power. You never cared about my name. You only reminded me how to become the man my mother hoped I would be. I reached for his hand without saying anything because some moments become smaller when too many words try to explain them. Together we stood quietly as evening sunlight filled the little kitchen. For the first time since I had entered the Romano estate, there were no titles left between us. No heir. No maid. No expectations heavy enough to silence the truth. Only two ordinary people who had found an extraordinary home inside each other's quiet courage. And if I learned anything from our story, it is this. A person may inherit wealth, influence, or an unforgettable family name, but the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind is becoming the place where another heart finally feels at home.